Alright, so this is crazy. This is outright insane. We have only one episode of Game of Thrones left. And in this week we had another battle episode predominantly, and that obviously means there's a lot more technical things to talk about, but there's still a lot that has happened in terms of story development. This really is the penultimate episode. Things are coming to a close, and so there is still a lot to discuss. Let's dive right into it. Now, for those of you who have watched all of my reviews of the episodes this season, you'll know that I've been predominantly positive about the season despite having issues. But I do want to take the time in this review to talk about, as I said, we get more context for the overall season with each progressive episode. And so it's much easier to look back and actually go, hey, maybe this thing didn't work as well as we thought it did, or maybe it worked better. And what I do really want to start with discussing, with everything that went down this week, with Daenerys kind of doing her thing and pretty much decimating King's Landing, I do want to talk about the fact that I quite often hear the term character assassination. Characters have been assassinated. They're doing things that they wouldn't usually be doing. This is bad writing. A blanket statement which doesn't tell us anything. Be specific, guys. Be specific. I do want to say that I think every decision characters have made, no matter how sudden they feel, have been in play. But what I do think, and I think this is a unanimous thing among all fans of the series, is that the show should have had, at minimum, another 2 episodes spread between the last season and this one. There needed to be more time spent. I don't care what the primary conflict of the episode is, but we need to see these characters' arcs in motion more. As I said in my last review, I fully buy Daenerys ending up at the point that she's at. I fully believe that that was something that was always in the works, even if we didn't want to believe it, even if we didn't want to see it. I think it has always been there. But I don't think, in the rush to get the show to the finish line, I don't think we got the time we needed to make it a fully understandable decision. I get it. I get how she's come to where she is. I get where all these characters around her have come to where they are now. But I think that we needed more time. And I'm not talking episodes like the first and second of this season. I don't think it's so much about characters sitting around talking. I think it's about putting them in situations where they're not just chatting with each other, where they're actually under pressure to make decisions. And we see that the big decisions that we're seeing happen, these big moments, are happening at a smaller scale. So when they do happen at this big scale, we can understand where those decisions have come from. I want to say that this episode on its own is probably the best of the season. This episode on its own feels like Game of Thrones, but I think what we've had preceding it has not necessarily supported us getting to this point. I think in a season that has 7 episodes, 8 episodes, the usual 10 episodes, this episode would feel like everything it needed to be. And yet, because the context was not there, there's gonna be gaps. There's gonna be parts where we're feeling like maybe that wasn't earned as well as it could be. Now, that doesn't change the fact I enjoyed every second of this episode, aside from the Varys stuff at the start. The Varys stuff we'll get onto talking about later. But I really enjoyed pretty much all of this episode. Miguel Sapochnik's direction here was incredible. Even if you thought the Battle of Winterfell was a letdown from a creative standpoint, I feel like the Battle of King's Landing should more than make up for it. It had a really, really glorious Children of Men vibe. The fact that, yeah, there's a bit of stuff with Daenerys until we leave her perspective on the back of Drogon from a bird's eye view, but then it all became about the people on the ground. And I think that was a very, very smart directing choice if the show is trying to push us to almost turn against Daenerys. I feel like showing that from the point of view of the ground, not look at the glory of this destruction, because for us as viewers, there's something glorious about seeing a dragon light up a city like that. It looks beautiful. But what's more interesting, I think, is by placing us on the ground where we can see the damage that's being done, that's where our empathy begins to shift. I think what's so interesting about Daenerys' shift in this episode, and I do feel like there was something iffy going on with her talking about mercy being her kind of, that's what makes her her, that's what's made her conquest work so well to begin with is her mercy and her empathy. But there is this constant conversation that the show has been having over the last 2 seasons of the fact that Westeros just isn't interested in Daenerys. And so I can understand almost the point of view of she's got a lot of rage, she's got a lot of anger, she's, made a lot of mistakes, not all of them her own, many of those have been her advisors. But I understand her rage, and I understand this idea of what if I just burnt it down and started again? And yeah, that's horrible. But I don't think the decisions she has made, no matter how terrifying and horrible, are out of character, out of the bounds of what we know she's capable of and what she wants. I think at this stage she's very much locked on, I want to be the ruler. I want to have that Iron Throne. It's something I said in my last review, was what a different circumstance it would be if she just stayed in Essos and ruled over Meereen and ruled over places where it seemed like the people really loved her. There was a drive to keep going, to push on, to move forward. And yes, she went and offered her armies to fight the dead, and she lost a lot. So yeah, I get now she's at the point where this is what I was owed, this is what I came for, this is what I want. I'm going to take it, and she's got a lot of rage. And again, there's a whole nother episode to see how this plays out. But her decision to do what she's done, no matter how terrible it is, no matter how awful and horrifying it is, I actually kind of understand it. And I might have made a misstep before to say that she was the Mad Queen. I didn't necessarily mean that in the way that she's crazy. I don't think she is. I think she's just mad. She's angry. And that's where this is coming from. The debate around Dany's morality is far more complex than I've even been able to get a handle on here. So I don't want to say that anything I've said here is concrete. This is just my current feelings on it, and I think we'll have a stronger idea of what the show is trying to say about her by the time we reach the finale next week. Next, I think it's important to talk about Jaime and Cersei, because I don't really know what to make of it yet. As I'd said in the past, I'd always expected that Jaime would kill Cersei and then take himself out now that he has nothing left to live for. He'd do the right thing and take her out. And that obviously did not happen. Instead, they died together, metaphorically crushed under the weight of all they'd done, I guess, all they'd wrought together. And so as an idea, I quite like the fact that no one took them out. They were pretty much just crushed. And I think that that's actually a much more powerful idea than we let on. I think there was a lot of hatred for Cersei and people wanting to see her murdered. And I think that what we got might actually be more profound. And I do need more time to sit with it and to think it over. But there was something incredibly poetic about that. And yeah, I guess it might be unsatisfying to some people, but when's the show ever been about satisfaction? You know what I mean? So look, there's interesting things about Jaime's character. He tried. I think it was interesting with this episode, seeing characters, as an overall thing, seeing characters that tried to beat who they are, who tried to overcome and tried to become someone better. And many of those characters did become better people along the way. Sandor Clegane, the Hound, became a better person along the way. Jaime became a better person along the way. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're able to beat the things that have driven who they are. For Sandor, it was the hatred of his brother. For Jaime, it was the love for his sister. They were never necessarily able to beat those things. And so I don't think that's flipping the character or reversing the character or undoing character work. I think it's bringing them back to the same point, but as different people. And I think there's a very powerful thing about that. People can't necessarily change entirely who they are. And I think the fact that these characters work towards changing that, these are pretty much my two favorite characters. And I think that was just as interesting for me to see that would be how they went out. Almost back at square one, but as different people. And that as an idea, I think is really great. And just thank God Jaime took out Euron. Oh my God. Yeah, that was satisfying. I'll give it that. That was satisfying seeing him. Yep, great. I will say though, again, because the past 2 seasons have been so rushed, we never really got a good idea of what Cersei was like as a ruler in the same way that we learned to understand Joffrey and Tommen and even Robert Baratheon. So I do think there's an interesting thing about in this episode, not necessarily understanding Cersei's relation to the people. You know, I know that the people of King's Landing were struggling, a lot of them were in poverty, but I think there was a lot more we could have mined out of Cersei's relationship to those she rules rather than just being a figurehead who sits in the Iron Throne. I think that gives us much more to either detest about her or love about her, and gives us a much stronger feeling about her in her final episodes. If there is one character's writing who we could call into question the most, I guess it would be Tyrion, who has felt like he has somewhat floated through much of this season, if not most of the last. And it's because quite often his decisions have led Daenerys down a path that has got us to where we are. I think he's made a lot of very questionable decisions. He hasn't been as smart as I feel like he is. And so, yeah, there's questionable stuff with the writing there. I think Tyrion's progression towards having a lot of empathy for the people around him, I think that's always been one of Tyrion's defining aspects, is because he's been so beaten down and broken and cast aside. He's always had a lot of empathy for people. And I think as he's seen the horrors of the world more and more, he's chosen to believe in people more when he shouldn't have, because people are going to play him a lot. And it seems to have continually happened. And I think he's very much been in a state of limbo because the real power moves, I guess, are going to happen in this final episode, much the same as Jon. Jon has very much been in a state of limbo where he's followed orders. And I think it's all really going to come to a head in the final episode. I think he's seen what Daenerys is capable of now, and he obviously does not agree with it. And so I think that's going to come to a head in the final episode. We're going to see both of those characters really start to take action. But I do have to question the whole beginning of this episode. I did find bizarre because Varys has seen a better option. I talked about this last review. Varys has seen a better option. He's going to want to jump on that. I understand this. But the decision of Daenerys to execute Varys and not Tyrion, despite it being Tyrion's fault, not that Tyrion had acted on it. Tyrion had made it clear that he did not want to act on the new information yet, while Varys did. Therefore, Varys is committing treason. It was very bizarre to me that she was like, yep, burn him and Tyrion is going to get off scot-free. More will come of this, I'm sure. More questions will be asked. We have one more episode to go. But that was very interesting to me. And as much as I loved the actual direction of that scene, Drogon coming out of the darkness, a great visual idea, I don't necessarily want to see Varys burning, but it felt like such a... I guess it's an appropriately devastating end to the character, but it also... I guess a somewhat anticlimactic one. I don't know how you guys feel about that. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with it. But in general, a lot of the deaths in this episode, because many happened, didn't necessarily feel as powerful as I think they could have. And that's not even down to writing decisions. I think the conviction of the direction and the writing that we do have in the show is very strong. I think it believes in what it's doing. And so there's very much an emotional momentum you can fall into. But just little things as characters are going to die, certain creative decisions you can make that build those moments up, a great push in on a character in their final shot usually elevates our emotion a little bit more. And so I do feel like it could have benefited at points having shots that did that. I will say though, Cleganebowl did happen and it did not feel like fan service to me. It felt like the logical end for Sandor's character. And not only was it a great, fight, a great confrontation, but the resolution to it, to see that, the Hound would go out, in flames, taking his brother down with him, is a beautifully poetic idea and really well executed. Speaking of execution, the mountain absolutely demolishing Qyburn was satisfying. I'll give it that. Overall with this episode, that's kind of, the content of it. I think Grey Worm's rage as well was another fantastic thing. Grey Worm's rage and being like, you know what, I've lost the person that I care the most about in the world, and he's angry. And I did find it interesting that the Northmen and the rest of the army turned and just took out innocent people so easily, so willingly, so instantaneously. I do think that's interesting, but I think if Game of Thrones has taught us one thing, it's never underestimate the bloodthirst of men. And so, yeah, that idea actually works for me. A lot of this episode was played on the ground perspective from Arya's point of view. A lot of it was also played from Jon's, but we have seen that a lot. We see a lot of battle sequences that are played from Jon's point of view. And I do like the fact that they chose to go from Arya's this time. I think seeing King's Landing, a location that we've spent so much time with, much in the way as Winterfell, seeing it kind of burn to the ground like that is discouraging, to say the least. There's something deeply upsetting about that, and the way that was directed, the way the destruction was directed, was truly gorgeous, down to the final moment of the episode. Some form of symbolism there of death on the pale horse, because I guess Arya is death. Something very interesting going on there, and just a beautifully quiet moment amid the wreckage before we head into the final episode. But all of that stuff, I really can't fault the direction of this episode. The fact that when Daenerys approached for her attack on the back of Drogon, she flew low to the ground. She actually had a technique this time to avoid the bolts. That does call into question how 3 arrows could hit a moving target in the previous episode and take out Rhaegal. As much as that was a shocking moment that I talked about last week, the logistics of that, way off. But in terms of, I think, the actual battle logistics of this episode, really fantastic. Better than they've been for the last 2 seasons. This is the best battle I think we've seen since Battle of the Bastards, and it really had those moments that not necessarily ebb and flow of battle, because that's not what this battle was about. It was about the chaos, and I think the chaos was expertly delivered, and I think it was really about drawing on those Children of Men, Saving Private Ryan influences once again that really managed to elevate it overall. And the music once again was fantastic. The Hear Me Roar theme, Cersei's theme that originated in season 6, playing over the credits, was just a wonderful touch on the episode. As always, there's more to discuss, and I've probably left a few things out, but these are the things that I was really passionate about. And while this episode might not have been as emotionally impactful as I'd have hoped for, considering more or less my 2 favorite characters met their demise in this episode, I don't think that this was anything less than pretty great TV, especially if you take this episode on its own a little bit more. On its own, this episode was everything I think Game of Thrones should be, and I think the problems that we have lie in the setup to get us to this point not being all that it should and could have been. And so I think that's where most of our problems lie. I wouldn't necessarily be as mad at this episode as I would be at the last ones. I think it's definitely recontextualized how much I've enjoyed the previous episodes. I think episode 1 and 2, while really having a lot of outstanding moments, should have almost worked harder. They felt very slow in hindsight, and I feel much more could have been done to elevate the threat of the Army of the Dead, have them wipe out certain places, have us learn more about them, have us spend more time with the other characters, have us spend more time learning how these characters are going to end up at the point in their character that they are now. You know, what brought them to make the decisions they make in this episode. And so, yeah, it works for me. I totally get if it doesn't for you, but I do think this might be pretty much the strongest episode of this season. And having no idea how the finale will go, I'm still satisfied at this point. I'm still going to reserve all my biggest judgments to once the story is over. Alright everyone, those are my thoughts on the latest episode of Game of Thrones. Obviously, I enjoyed it despite having some issues, but I do want to hear what you guys thought of this episode. Let's have some civil, constructive discussions in the comments. No use throwing hate at each other because we disagree. Let's actually try to evolve and expand our understanding of the art we consume. That is the point of conversations. It's not to be, yeah, I'm right about this, and yes, you're wrong. Let's actually have some interesting conversations because there's so many to be had about this show in the state it is in at the point we are at. If you want to see my review of the final episode next week, be sure to subscribe to this channel. You can also see a whole bunch of other cool content because I post a lot of cool stuff. You guys can also follow me on Twitter at Loverboymedia and on Instagram at Breaking Banter. And if you do really want to help support this channel, you can support on Patreon. Thank you so much to all of you who are doing that already. You guys are just amazing. And yeah, you're all amazing. I'll see you guys for one more Game of Thrones review next week.